Is the UFC the worst organization in MMA? Now, I know.
Blasphemy! He said it again!
Before you start punching casual into your keyboards so hard that you actually break the keys, yeah? Before you start rage commenting, just slow down, okay? Like, you don't be a plasterer from Melbourne that has just started an MMA YouTube channel by hating the UFC. Like, obviously there is a reason I'm asking you this question, and it's right here. So I was scrolling through MMA Twitter yesterday morning as I was taking my pre-work dump, and I noticed this graph. It shows the UFC has one of the lowest finish rates in all of MMA for 2023. And I was just thinking to myself, like, yeah, that's not surprising at all. That makes total sense. And then my brain started to say to myself, that's probably why when you're chilling out at home, Doug, just wanting to relax, you don't actually chuck the UFC on the TV. You'll throw on One or Cage Warriors or Eternal here in Australia. And my brain just started to slowly fill some things in. And before we really get into this, I'm just going to ask again, is the UFC the worst question in MMA? And I'm going to give you just a few things to think about before you go ahead and answer that question down there in the comments. The first one and the most obvious one is that this is just a graph that shows the rate of finishes, and it really depends, why did you get into the sport in the first place? Some people, they grow up in a martial arts family and the whole sport to them is about the tradition of martial arts. Like, some people, they get into jiu-jitsu or kickboxing or karate as kids in those martial arts families, and they grow up with a huge amount of respect for the technical side of our sport. So maybe to them, the finishes aren't as important as seeing the mastery of the skills, like the mastery of Adesanya and his kickboxing, or Wonderboy's karate, or watching Oliveira use jiu-jitsu in MMA, or Bo Nichols wrestling. That's what it's all about to them. And if it is truly the skill in the MMA that matters, people who follow the sport for that, then they get to see that skill at one of the highest levels most weekends of the year. That's what that would mean. So to them, no, the UFC is one of the best organizations, or at least that's what this graph would sort of show you because of the low finish rate. But it also could suggest that the UFC just has brilliant and fair matchmaking, and it puts the masters of those two skills together, and half the time it shows that styles do make fights, and the other half of the time it shows that there are really competitive battles happening in the UFC with that nearly 50% finish rate compared to some of the other organizations that we see on this graph. There is also another thing that could be skewing this graph, and that's to consider that the UFC is one of the organizations, and you'll notice the organizations that do this towards the bottom of the graph, that mixes the genders on their cards. The UFC has MMA and WMMA on the same card, and WMMA does get lower finish rates. It does have a lower skill level than MMA, and that could skew the graph too. But there's other reasons that you could look at this graph and think to yourself, oh, maybe the UFC isn't one of the best organizations out there. Look, look at it like this. It all depends, again, on how you got into this sport. Like, if you're like me, I'm a man, right? And I like this sport because I grew up in a place called Victoria, Australia, and my state is called the nanny state. You know that Australia that you heard about on the news a couple of years ago? It's that Australia. It's that state that pulled all that nonsense during the 2020 drama when it all unfolded. That's my state. That's the state that I grew up in. And that mindset in this culture that has surrounded me as I grew up didn't just pop up out of nowhere in 2020. My state has always had that mindset. Like, they were literally tearing up kids' playgrounds and covering them in rubber as I grew up. You can get breath tested for riding a push bike in my state. It's the nanny state. If you're driving your car too fast, then the government here has the right to take it and crush it into a cube. And that's the environment that I grew up in. And I am unapologetically a man. I like action movies. I like beer. I like my girlfriend's ass. And as Masvidal would say, I like violence. And even in my local sport of Australian rules football, everything around me growing up was getting constantly nerfed by this need for safety. And then around 2015, I found UFC highlights on YouTube. I found the blood. I found John Jones's elbows from the top. I found Conor McGregor. Yes, I am a Conor baby in this sport. He is one of the many reasons that got me into this sport. I saw people getting knocked out, kicked down, the fight dragged on onto the ground until one man choked another man out, and I was in love from the moment I saw it. It's the violence that drew me into MMA. MMA and the violence back in 2015 showed me that there was a place where a man could still be a man somewhere in the Western world. And then as my love for the UFC and MMA grew, my love for the entire sport fell into place. Like the rankings, the fighters, the techniques, and it all came together. Even the UFC, the way the UFC runs itself as a business. All these characters of the fighters, the way that they don't care what you think about them, whether it's Diaz who doesn't care what you think about him, or the nice guy Cowboy who doesn't care what you think about him. But at the end of the day, the UFC takes all of that and packages it in really high level of competition of MMA. And I really appreciate that, I do. But sometimes I just want to watch people fight, like violently, with a little bit more skill than, say, the backyard brawls that you get on YouTube these days. I want to find something nicely in the middle. And I do find that the amateur guys or the amateur organizations external from the UFC, guys in, say, Cage Warriors or Eternal, they're really hungry to make a name for themselves and they don't feel that safety of a UFC contract. Do you know what I mean by this? The safety of, like, they've got a couple of wins under their contract, they're in the UFC, and they don't want to lose their ranking, whether it's from 25 to 15. Those guys in that mix where they're just nice and comfortably in the UFC. The blokes that are outside of that are still young and hungry up and comers, are pushing themselves on these other cards to make a name for themselves, to get on the Contender Series, to get in the UFC. They're so hungry. And when you mix that level of hunger with a little bit of the lesser skill level of the UFC, it does make for more dangerous fights, and more dangerous fights do lead to more exciting fights. And again, the whole thing is not packaged like it's backyard brawls. Yeah, there's a level of professionalism and production that I still appreciate when I watch those cards, when I see the way that they're packaged. The other thing is, when you look at how it's all packaged, the smaller organizations, the other organizations, they're not handcuffed by the ESPN schedule. Like, I'm sure we've all experienced this watching a UFC fight night at the Apex. There's been a finish and we're sitting around waiting for the next fight for 20 minutes before that Apex lackluster walkout even starts. On the other cards, the show just moves faster, which again often makes for a more entertaining fight card. So you might be thinking like, geez, Doug, it sounds like you really don't like the UFC that much. I thought you loved the UFC. And I do love the UFC. I always talk about how a strong UFC is good for the sport. But like any relationship, it's not perfect. The UFC is not perfect, but it is the best thing that we have. I do think that the UFC still has some of the best doctors. The Apex has some of the best nutritionists. They have the best media coverage. They have the Apex, the best training facilities you would want if you wanted to be in MMA. And if more fighters were in the UFC and it was the only organization in the game, then we would never have to worry about who is the best fighter in the world. You know, like just look at Francis Ngannou or John Jones. We would never have to worry about that because they would all be under the umbrella of the UFC, the contracts would be done, and we could get these fights happening instead of the boxing side of things that we are now starting to slide towards, where there are many different organizations. And now even like look at the MVP thing that's just happened. Fighters are starting to become truly independent contractors, which is great for the fighter, but horrible for the fans. With fighters being truly independent contractors, that happens in boxing, and it takes years for the proper fights to come together, years for the proper champions in boxing to actually meet up and put on a fight. And if someone in that main event gets injured in training camp or sick on the weight cut, the whole event just falls apart because there aren't these structured organizations like the UFC where people can just step in on last notice and keep us entertained, which happened heaps in 2023 in the UFC. Nothing entertains like the UFC does. From Bruce Buffer's call-outs to that feeling of a truly big fight in the division and the entire week leading up to that big fight. ONE, Bellator, PFL, they just cannot tell stories and run press conferences the way that the UFC does. When you're a UFC fan, you get entertainment all week, and it leads up to a highly competitive fight at the end of the week. When I watch Eternal or ONE or Cage Warriors, I just chuck it on. I don't care about any of the guys. I just know that if I've had a long day at work and I hang out and watch it, I'm gonna have a good time. And my mind is only on it for as long as it's on my screen. Whereas the UFC, you know, I take that with me all week. I'll be sitting on the dunny or hanging drywall, and the UFC is there in my mind in some way entertaining me, whether it's the news or the matchmaking or the replays. That whole makes the UFC still the best in the game to me. But why did you get into the sport? Put that down there in the comments. There are so many different reasons, probably why we all call each other casuals, because we all see the sport from different angles. So why did you get into the sport of MMA? What are your favorite organizations to watch outside of the UFC? Leave a comment down there, just like a Aussie did, some random Aussie. Aljo, he left a comment on the what was it called? He left a comment on the Aljamain Sterling is now a prelim fighter video. Aljo is getting the rough end of the stick here for a former champ. Not sure if he deserves the prelim slot, but it is what it is. Do better, win over the fans, get some goddamn clout and exposure. Let's go. That's so true, Aussie. The thing is, we get this Yuri Prochazka-Rakic fight on the UFC 300 main card because Yuri has such a strong fan base, and Aljo's done nothing but work with the UFC, and it does seem like he is getting punished for it. It's hard for him because he keeps trying to entertain the fans like he did at Fury, and they just keep booing him. I think Aljo is in the right mindset. He just has to press on, and eventually the fans will start to be on his side. The exact same thing happened to Daniel Cormier, and now everyone loves him. He's the big daddy bear of the UFC. So let me know your thoughts. What are the organizations you like to watch outside of the UFC? Why did you get into the sport of MMA? Put it down there in the comments, just like Aussie did. If you're still here watching this deep into the video, that means maybe you've been entertained in some way, giving you a different perspective. If you could say thank you by going ahead and hitting that subscribe button down there before you go ahead to your next video, I would really appreciate that. Small creators like myself appreciate every single sub, and I will see you all in the next video.